Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is Sean Whelan, and I'm here to chair this evening's proceedings, which means we're going to have some questions and answers at the end of things. I suppose we should just get straight on with the lecture itself, given by Professor Philip Lane, who's Professor of International Macroeconomics here at Trinity College Dublin, on a topic which we're all going to be faced with taking an exam on later on, which is the Fiscal Compact Treaty, or the European Stability Treaty, or the Austerity Treaty, or whatever it's called today. I hope Professor Lane will give us a good explanation of what it is and what it's all about, and provide us with some food for thought, and provide you with some questions which hopefully you'll put to him afterwards, and hopefully he will provide us with some more answers to. So over to you, Philip.
Okay. So I wanted to hold this event for two reasons. One is to go through the economics of the Fiscal Compact. So I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a strategist, but there is, at the core of this is a big economics question. So my plan is to maybe speak for about half an hour to go through my presentation, but then the second part is really to open it up, to provide an opportunity for people to make comments or to ask questions about this topic. So this is an event which is hosted and organised by the Policy Institute. You might have come to some of these events before, but let me signal it's going to be a few more over the next month or so during this academic season. So you can find out more about the calendar of events at tcd.ie/Policy Institute. Hopefully you can take a look. Okay, so the Fiscal Compact is something I'm very happy to talk about, because in fact I initially started writing about this idea essentially in 1994. So this has been a topic I've been following since the mid-90s, since I did my PhD, because the idea that fiscal policy can go badly wrong around the world is not a new idea. The idea that governments need help in how they set fiscal policy is not a new idea. And essentially, over time, there's a big convergence on the idea that the setting of fiscal policy has to be done in some kind of framework. And over time, the ideas about these frameworks, I hope, are getting a bit better. That there have been various ideas at various points in time which have been essentially overly crude, overly narrow, and the new generation of European reforms in this area, I hope, avoid some of those basic mistakes, and that's part of what I'm going to go through. I'll just pause to let the others take their seats. So the basic principle behind the Fiscal Compact, or any kind of fiscal rule, is the third point there, which is the trade-off between commitment and discretion. So this is the language used. So if you had a brilliant genius government who were far-sighted, cared and knew what to do all the time, it's always good to have discretion. Just let that government set fiscal policy every year according to conditions that year. And that essentially has been the history, is that if we have a brilliant, fantastic government, just leave them to it. And quite often you might hear current politicians take that view, is just let us do fiscal policy, we'll be fine. The problem is that if you don't have a brilliant, genius government, if you leave politicians just do what makes sense in any given year, you can come up with outcomes which go badly wrong. And so the alternative is essentially to have a commitment view, which is a legislation, a constitutional amendment, whatever is the device, commits the government to following a set of rules. And that makes sense if a government left to its own devices is subject to bias. And there are two biases that researchers have looked at. One is the bias towards having too much public debt. And then the other one is the bias towards being pro-cyclical. So having too much public debt, there's many ways to think about that. But I think at the core of it is that governments have short horizons, whereas public debt, the main costs of it are in the future. So in any given year, the temptation is, if I need to finance a bit of extra spending, or if I want to implement a tax cut, it's tempting to finance that with a little bit more debt. Because the alternative, if I want to spend more, is to raise more taxes, and that loses votes. So essentially, if you have governments which have an eye to the current electoral cycle, it's tempting to let public debt be the residual, to let public debt go up over time. And the history of the last 30 or 40 years is that public debt ratios have trended upwards. And it's a very simple observation, but I think it's quite robust. The idea that the government who borrows is not the government who has to make the repayments in the future. The second bias is pro-cyclicality, which is, in principle, for Keynesian stabilization, in a boom, you're supposed to cool it down. What does that mean? It means saying, okay, we have all this tax revenue coming in, but we're not going to spend it. We're going to save it for the rainy day. And again, it's tempting, in the phrase, there was one philosopher about 10 years ago who said, when I have it, I spend it. And there is a temptation to have that. If you have all of this revenue rolling in, cut taxes or raise spending. So those two biases end up with a situation where the textbook Keynesian ideal type government we don't observe in too many countries. And another way of saying that is, even if politicians or senior civil servants want to do the right thing, they're just scared that the electorate won't agree with them at that point in time. So one of the European bureaucrats said that recently enough, saying they know what to do, but they don't know how to do what's necessary and get re-elected. So whether you point a finger at the political process, you point a finger at the incentives of politicians, there seems to be a difficulty of running fiscal policy and at the same time running a democratic system. So if you put all of that together, the idea is, well, let's commit. Let's restrict the ability of governments to overborrow. Let's restrict the ability of governments to spend revenue windfalls. And that is really the philosophy behind the Fiscal Compact and the associated rules. So again, it's easy to say this is not the best outcome. I agree, it's not the best. The best is to have a genius government who always does the right thing. But if you don't have a genius government who always does the right thing, having a second best of having some rules can make sense. Now you might say this has been tried before. We've had the Stability and Growth Pact. I think that's right. But again, the new wave recognises that de facto Brussels or the other member countries cannot really set fiscal policy for any individual member state. First of all, the democratic deficit is too big. And second of all, even if they want to, it's just too difficult. There's not all that many bureaucrats in Brussels. They don't really understand each national economy. And so the ideal from their point of view is, let's have national rules as a first line of defence. And we only have to get involved if it becomes ridiculous. We only have to get involved if these debt ratios get extreme or the cyclical management gets very far from ideal. So this is essentially why there's an insistence now that you have to use the national local system. It has to be a local legislation because the idea of running it from Brussels has not worked and it's not going to work, except as a second line of defence. The first line of defence has to be domestic. So you might say, well, you know, fiscal policy was not, except apart from Greece, fiscal policy was not at the root of this crisis. And also fiscal reform is not the most important reform that's needed. I perfectly agree. So the issue is that's all of these other reforms are not yet on offer. So, you know, one way to think about it is it's a gateway reform. So, you know, if Europe agrees to the Fiscal Compact, it opens the gate to more interesting reforms which are more important. So it's a precondition. We've already seen essentially the ECB say it's been helpful to them that the Fiscal Compact has been agreed in principle in order to go big time into liquidity operations. You can also envisage it as being helpful if they decide to re-enter the sovereign bond market in a big way. Because again, the whole idea of the ECB is they're happy to intervene whenever governments are solvent, if it's just liquidity. But if there's a doubt about sovereign repayment, then there's a fear of the ECB coming in to bail out insolvent governments. It's very hard to determine insolvency at any point in time. One way you can do it is say, look, the deficit might be huge today, but they've got a plan. The Fiscal Compact commits these governments to get those deficits back down to balance at some point in the future. And that gives the ECB cover to intervene. We already know that it's a condition for accessing ESM funding in the future. I'll come back to that later, because to some people that's a sufficient condition to vote. It's a pity to narrow the debate to that, because it may not be the case we ever need ESM funding. And anyway, for legitimacy, a constitutional amendment is forever. So the short-run impact of the ESM should not be the turning point. If you believe in the necessity for Eurobonds in the future, the key issue with Eurobonds is you're scared that if you're jointly liable for repayment, that some other member country is going to go off and act in a crazy way. So if you want to have a jointly issued Eurobonds, there has to be a mechanism to make sure each member country behaves in a fiscally responsible way. Because otherwise, each country would be tempted to use the joint debt to fund local spending or tax cuts and let the others, if they have to default, let the others bail them out. So it's necessary for that. A big one is having, I think there's the single strongest area of consensus in economics is that if you have a common currency, we've seen that having national banking systems is not a good idea. Because if there's a banking system that gets into trouble, it overwhelms the local government. So in the same way, a housing problem in Arizona or Florida is not the responsibility of the Arizona state government or the Florida state government. It's a federal responsibility. In a common currency area, having the banking sector to be a joint responsibility sounds like a good idea. But that can only happen, again, if you have fiscally stable national countries. Because otherwise, the local government will just put pressure on the local banks to lend to the sovereign and say, well, if you lose money on us, the rest of the system will bail you out. So you have to have fiscally stable national governments to have a banking union. This agency in Brussels calculates it doesn't take that much. If you do have fiscally responsible governments, all you need is about 2% of GDP in terms of revenue to finance a banking union. If you believe in fiscal initiatives such as federal, EU-level investment programs and so on, again, that can only really work if each member state is fiscally stable. So you might say, well, the treaty doesn't talk about any of that. So there is a leap of faith issue here, which is, the sequencing is only, Mrs. Merkel might say, only when we have the fiscal responsibility agreed can we talk about these other issues. The idea that you have one huge Big Bang reform which solves everything simultaneously, there's a fear, if you're in that kind of bargaining situation, I think some of the creditor countries would be fearful that the easy stuff gets agreed and the hard stuff, which is fiscal solvency, falls away. So there's a clear sequencing here. Get the most difficult commitment first and everything else can come later. But if you are minded to disbelieve in the dynamics of the European project, you might disagree with that. Another point to say is there's nothing really in the Fiscal Compact that is not in local initiatives. So each of the main parties, including Sinn Féin, before the election in their manifestos had something corresponding to a fiscal responsibility bill in their promises. There was an Oireachtas Joint Committee report with a lot of the major politicians on that committee. Wrote a report in November 2010. I wrote the background report for it, so I'm familiar with it. And they signed up to this concept. The Department of Finance came out with a report in March 2011. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council came out with a report in January. And there is a commitment to bring forward this bill by the end of June. So basically, what's in the Fiscal Compact was already down the tracks. The only difference is that there is a constitutional amendment as opposed to a legislative bill only. It's important also that the Fiscal Compact is pretty high level. It's a pretty short document, and you might say it leaves out a lot of detail. But the detail are in these corresponding regulations and directives which were agreed in December. And essentially the Fiscal Compact is essentially saying in order to reinforce the details of those regulations and directives, let's make sure that some of the core elements are written into domestic legislation. So we have the six-pack regulations from November, and there's further proposals from the European Commission. So in the Fiscal Compact, what's in there is there's a commitment that countries try to achieve structural budget balance. What does that mean? In fact, there isn't a numerical target. It's that each country meets its country-specific medium-term budget objective, which is a bit of a mouthful. But the idea here is it's a lesson from the past. You don't put down a number which is going to be violated. You put down a principle, which is there has to be some kind of plan which differs across countries, in line with demographics, in line with initial debt levels, a lot of other things. There is the idea that over time, these structural targets should not exceed half of 1% of GDP for high debt countries or 1% of GDP for low debt countries. So there is a floor, if you like, to it. And then there's also commitment that if you don't start off now in 2012, 2013, where you want to be, you get there over time. And also, if you make a plan for a year and the year turns out differently, you fix it over time. So I'll come back to some of this in a bit. And then, again, to be specific about one element of that is if you're a high debt country, over time you bring that debt down, but in a pretty slow pace, the 1/20th rule. So again, this is important, that it's a set of principles rather than a very rigorous fixed number. The target is reset every 3 years, so it could be reset in line with this, different changes in government, for example. It will change according to your demographic situation, how quickly you're growing, and so on. It leaves open about what the right number is. So countries may differ on this. It's going to be country specific. One country might say, we're so vulnerable, we're so risky, we can't afford to have much public debt. So we're going to go for a debt target of 20% in the long run. Another country might say, we're not a risky country, we only have small recessions, we can live with a 50% debt target. So there's not one target for everyone. And this is where there's going to be a lot of public debate about risk management. I was in New Zealand last year a few times, and this is what their politicians talk about. Should the debt target be 20% or 30%? Because it's all about, risk. We know that high debt levels might be okay, but then if financial markets get scared, very quickly they become unstable. So the trade-off of saving up by having a low debt level versus taking more risk, that's a valid political debate. It's also important to say it's silent on what is the size of government. Essentially says feel free to have a 90% of GDP government sector so long as you tax people to pay for it. So the Fiscal Compact is essentially saying revenue and spending have to be aligned over time. It doesn't say you need to have a small government. It doesn't say you need to have a big government. And this is why when a new government comes in, there'll be a renegotiation. They might say, well, listen, and in the UK debate, you've seen this, the Labour Party might say the right rate of spending to GDP is 45%. Right now it's 40, and over time we want to bring it up. The Tories might say, well, we inherited 50% GDP ratio, we want it down to 45, and over time it's going to come down. So there's no problem in principle. It's silent on the orientation of a government. All it says is, if you want to have more spending, you can't magic it up. You have to tax over time to line it up. So there's been a lot of critiques in the media about how can you write a constitutional law with a concept that is not observable. This idea of a structural budget balance. So the idea of a structural budget balance is you take out the impact of the cycle. We know in recessions that tax revenue goes down and unemployment payments go up. And in booms, the reverse happens. There are ways you can mechanically subtract those cyclical factors. So the question is, what's the alternative? The alternative is just to look at the overall budget balance. And if you say the overall budget has to be balanced, what that means is in a recession, when tax revenues fall, you have to cut spending or raise tax rates. In a boom, when tax revenues go up, you raise spending or cut tax rates. So you get pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which is the exact opposite of what you want. So in the US, 25 years ago, there was a law to balance the budget, but it's written in that format. It was nuts because essentially the fiscal policy was amplifying the cycle rather than cooling it down. So you have to look at the structural balance because the overall balance would give you the wrong signals. It's important to say that it doesn't, on top of the automatic impact of the cycle, the regulations do allow for active fee to do extra, both in a boom. If you want to cool down the boom by actively raising taxes, say on housing in a housing boom, that's fine. And you can use that extra savings to do more in a recession. You don't just have to use the automatic stabilizers, you can have a stimulus program and so on. But the point is, that's only feasible if it's symmetric. In the boom times, you collect extra revenue to pay for the rainy day. And the detailed regulations are perfectly clear that that is allowed for. It's clear also that the level of public investment is allowed for. So often you say, well, I want to borrow because I have a public investment project. That is allowed for in the detailed regulations. Not all of this appears in the treaty because the treaty needs to be read in line with the detailed regulations. But the detailed regulations do allow for that. Now, we know that the structural balance is hard to measure because people disagree about whether the economy is growing because of a positive trend or because of the cycle. But if you like, that in a sense is good news because that means the range under which people can argue is quite broad. That there's only really a feasible chance of some kind of intervention if you go beyond that broad range. If you like, even today with the Spanish decision, this idea that Spain got a next law of less austerity is in the spirit because no one in Brussels could really stand over and say that the difference between 4.4 and 5.5 or whatever the outcome is going to be now is purely a structural imbalance. You can argue that at that level of difference, it's a cyclical imbalance which will disappear when the Spanish economy recovers. So the range of variation over which Brussels will say, we can't really insist that you do any more is quite wide. It is not the case that this is going to be a super strict policy because it's not plausible to say that you know with precision where the structural balance is. It's more like a range. That's going to be the case. You might say we're at -1. I might say we're at +2. But some kind of range there, there'll be no kind of penalties imposed. So I was in Brussels in November at a public finance event, and the essential consensus there was the only scenarios under which the sanctions will be imposed is when fiscal policy becomes ridiculously extreme, when it's so obviously far from what is safe that you can make the case. Because to make a case, if you like, in a legal setting, it has to be a rock-solid case. And that really is only going to come into play in terms of avoiding another Greece-type situation. One important part of the treaty is that if you do make an error, a forecast error, you do have to make it up later on. So Greece apparently had fantastic fiscal rules. It was all about next year's budget. So if it turned out that this year's budget was far looser than they planned, bygones are bygones. You just move on. Whereas, you know, and this is where there is some kick in it, which is if you fail to meet your budget target because you were over-optimistic about GDP or you're over-optimistic about tax revenue, that failure has to be corrected over time. In the German rule and the Swiss rule, there is a correction mechanism. Again, it's very slow. It is not the case that if your revenue is 1 billion on the target this year, you have to raise 1 billion next year. It's much more gradual than that. Okay, debt reduction. So this is the 120th rule in action. It says that the debt you should be targeting in a given year, relative to 60%, should gradually come down. So it's 0.95, which is 120, you know, 1 minus 120th of last year's debt relative to 60%, and it's a moving average of last year, the year before, the year before that. So it's not the case that there's some huge debt reduction strategy every year. It's just that over time it will come down. And again, this is an improvement on the Department of Finance's proposal from last year, because essentially how quickly you have to bring that down depends on how quickly you're growing and what interest rate you're paying. And the Department of Finance were silent about those issues last year. So this is an important point now, which is, as I said, there could be a difference of opinion about where the economy is and therefore what the structural balance is. What is true is there's not going to be much weight given to a government's opinion, because the government will always have the incentive to be over-optimistic. So what's coming down the tracks is either you take the European Commission view, and that's what's actually in the German constitution, they just take the European Commission forecast, or you have a local independent forecast. And that is something where Ireland has not got right now, is they haven't officially allocated to some local independent agency the responsibility for making the forecast. So in the UK, they moved to it last year with the Office of Budget Responsibility. In the Netherlands, there's the Central Planning Bureau, which sounds a bit Stalinist, but it's just a quasi-independent forecasting bureau. You could argue it could be the ESRI, it could be the central bank, it could be the Department of Finance could carve out an Office of Budget Responsibility, it could be the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, but it's not in their current mandate. But someone needs to do this on an independent basis, someone who's not beholden to government. It cannot be local civil servants. And that is something in the Irish debate has to be worked on. So let me just conclude at this, is that the Fiscal Compact is a little bit about the last crisis, in the sense of, you know, number one, it's about avoiding the Greek fiscal, misbehaviour. But it's mostly in terms of avoiding future crises, because a low level of public debt and fiscal responsibility, as I say, is a gateway to these other reforms. You might say it'd be ideal if all of these reforms were simultaneously on the table, but I think there's a case for sequencing, which is the current situation. And then the final point, which I think is important about this debate, which is why I think in the end a referendum debate has some value, even though many people opposed it, is that this only works if the political system actually believes it. Because there's so many different ways for politicians to get around accounting rules. So you can have all sorts of creative accounting. First of all, you can just have fake accounting, but you can start saying, well, we're going to spend through the utility companies rather than through the official sector. We're going to not call that a tax, we're going to call it something else. we're going to forget to pay the pharmaceutical companies. So in other words, you can borrow by deferred payment of invoices. There's all sorts of ways this can be undone if they want to. So the only way that this is going to work is if politicians actually believe this is a good idea. And in many countries, they've accepted that, saying, listen, we want to argue about the size of government. Should it be a left-wing, should it be a right-wing philosophy about the role of government in society, the extent of redistribution, the right level of public investment? Those are the interesting debates. It's not too interesting, and we have no competence to discuss about whether the economy is in a positive phase of the cycle or a negative phase of the cycle. That is a boring technocratic issue. Charlie Horry, I think, used to say that there should be some room somewhere with a bunch of economists. You slip questions under the door and then you get the answer back. And that's the extent of the political engagement of economists. And I have some sympathy with that in the sense of, for these questions, that's all you need, is slip the question, where are we in the cycle, under the door and get an answer back. Politicians should be about the bigger questions. So you can come up with scenarios where a political system does say, fantastic, we'll just worry about the big stuff. Let the technocrats worry about the cycle. I'm not totally sure whether the Irish system, even though they signed on to this Oireachtas report 2 years ago, I'm not totally sure whether everyone has arrived at that point yet. So let me stop there and open it up for comments and questions.